Awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome on this fine Thursday evening to our conversation about anti-GBV as a movement after 1 year. Basically, looking at where we started, where we're going, what we can do, what we should have done, the coulda, woulda, shouldas, how we're about, just dissecting what's happened over the past year and few. And I think to start that conversation, sort of reliving where Stellies was that resulted in us becoming this more official sort of movement, for lack of better words, the anti-GBV SU. So I don't know if you want to start just maybe giving a bit of a contextual as to how we came about, and then from there we can start picking that apart.
Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. Yeah, I've got really bad connection, so just let me know if at any point I start breaking off. And anyone's free to interrupt me, to correct me or to add anything. But basically, what I know of the movement, where the movement started, let me say when it really got traction and when it started growing was on last year, middle of the year last year too, like third term vibes. And it really, I think, it really took off because of just the rise in anti-gender based violence around the country. When Nene went missing, and then when her body was eventually found, and when news the way she was brutalized, when all of that happened, and I think it really sort of triggered a lot of students on our campus. It really, I think, motivated a lot of people to start coming forward with their stories, sharing their their past with gender-based violence in life, but also specifically on campus. And I think especially because of our campus's history with rape culture and everything else, where this is not a conversation that started last year. This is not something we tried to start fixing last year. But I think at that point, it's when all the students realized actually nothing is really happening. We've had this conversation many times before, but we haven't seen any change, and it's scary for us to think that if anything like this were to happen to one of our students, nothing good would come out of it, or there wouldn't be justice served, especially in an institutional context. And I think from that is essentially when the movement was birthed, or when the movement as we know it today was birthed, being a movement full of these activists who are fighting against gender-based violence on campus. And then I think as well, when people started now coming forward with stories of just very problematic cultures in the residences on campus, in the main reses in particular, that sort of perpetuated rape culture. And I think also us being students and us wanting to educate ourselves a lot more, understanding that if rape culture is perpetuated and if problematic ways aren't fixed, they do eventually and can eventually lead to gender-based violence. And so us wanting to sort of prohibit and prevent something as brutal as someone's death on campus occurring before, us wanting to prevent that from occurring by fixing what's going on campus. So I think that's a brief look into what events led to the movement being what it is today. And then also, I guess, like I said, just students joining in, putting fuel to the fire, our institution not necessarily reacting in the way we would have wanted it to react as well, putting fuel to the fire. And then now with COVID, us going online saw the movement grow a lot bigger than anyone could have imagined because of us going online and us now getting national recognition from institutions around the country. Yeah, so I think that's a bit of background on the anti-GBV movement. SU.
Thanks, Viwe. I'm gonna ask, as we all go around and give our little input, could you maybe just introduce like the perspective you're in? Hey everyone, my name's Viwe. I do cool things in XYZ ways, all those great things.
No problem. Hi everyone. My name is Anna. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the officer and a very, very active member of the anti-GBV movement.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, now that we've got a bit of context as to where we started, I think the big old question that's brought us here together is how far have we come? Because it's quite clear that when we started off, catcalling was like not even understood. The people didn't even understand the definition of rape on campus when they had been victims of assault, and they were like, what? That's problematic because of how we've painted violence to look like. There's a lot of things on campus that people need to become more aware of and to engage with. So I think the next question is really how far we've come. And I think the best way to look at that is to start off with what were the main things we started doing when we rose up at the end of last year, right? And I think the biggest moment was everyone on the Roy plane. So for those of you not at Marty's, it's just like this giant brick. It's just a big brick plane where we all congregate to the top of the library to have all the chats. And members of Veteran and management were, sorry, I just want to admit, okay, members of Veteran and management were there, and there were members of students sharing their story and handing over a memorandum. And the word memorandum became quite renowned on campus because we drafted this memorandum where we were like, listen, you keep saying that we're bringing up issues and you don't know what to do about it. Here's what you need to agree to do and do something about it. We identified the fact that campus security was lacking in the following ways, how unattentive members of staff were being. We highlighted certain unsafe routes on campus, microaggressions that weren't being properly addressed, the lack of intersectional understandings in our modules, just listed everything that they could tangibly do to make an actual difference in this memorandum, and also made numerous other memorandums. So some to try to explain what would be beneficial for resident spaces and private student accommodation hubs to do to make a change in their respective areas to aid to the movement, and what we as members of the movement expected them to do to make spaces safer for women and queer bodies. And I think the best place to then start off the rest of the to carry on with the conversation would be to look at what's happened with the memorandums. How far has Stelli's come with these are the things you can do to make a difference. What magical differences have been made on campus? Let's unpack that. I'm not sure if who would like to take that question, or I don't make me that maths teacher, please. Okay, let's go.
I don't mind dropping that off. Hi everyone, my name is Tejo. I'm one of the main admin members of the Anti-GBV SU Instagram page, and I'm also a former student at Stellenbosch University. Also worked with the Queer Us organization, which is a queer society for students on campus. And just as a person, getting involved in anti-GBV SU was almost not even a question, because just the way in which things are handled in the institution is almost shocking, and I think part of the reason why anti-GBV SU, as we know it, also came to be is because of the fact that we knew that we were going to get nowhere by just speaking to the institution. So we decided to go the route that they understood best, which is through paper, by putting things in black and white and having people sign these memoranda, agree to understand. And I think in addressing how far we've come in handling those things, we also need to look at what the reception of those memorandums looked like, because I don't think it was a secret on campus that a lot of the men's raisers were very opposed to joining the movement because they saw it as a personal attack to themselves and to their traditions and to their culture. Now, our biggest question to them at that point was, what exactly is this culture that you're protecting? What do those traditions look like, and what are they feeding into these men that live in these residence spaces? And that's not just to say that it was men's residences, because our women's residences are also very conservative and also very built on tradition and culture. So that's partially what we wanted to look at in what was written in these memorandums. And for the most part, it was all just very small. I don't want to say small, but I think what we wanted to focus on was the small things that build up. It's the socials where women are told, okay, you have to dress nice because you might meet your husband tonight, you know, that kind of a thing. And that's a lot of what we wanted to address, because in when these incidents of violence happen, and that doesn't have to be like, you know, hectic violence, super aggressive situations, but just even the small things like being touched in a way that you don't want to be touched, being looked at by people you don't want to look at you in a certain way. In reporting those incidents, those things don't get taken seriously because the smaller things aren't taken seriously, you know? So I think in how these residences took these memorandums, I think a lot of them were very apprehensive because they felt like that would mean a very big change to how they conducted their daily routines and to how they inducted newcomers into their residence space. And I think that scared a lot of people because change is strange. Change is a lot of the time scary. And part of that change comes with admitting that you've done wrong before. And I think that that's a very big part of why perhaps some of the memorandum demands haven't been met as yet, and why some of these demands seem so scary is because people are apprehensive to admit that we have all been complicit in one way or another.
Thank you so much. And for those of you outside of Stellies, if I'm not mistaken, on our official Instagram account, we do have the sort of summarized version of the memorandum in our link tree in our bio. So if you want to have a look at what some of those demands are, feel free to go have a look and then engage in conversation. So I think now would be a great time to sort of pull the conversation towards Jacques there in the corner. I see you. And basically, like, you're a member of the House Committee in men's residence, right? And I'm sure you've had to engage numerous times with male privilege and people being entitled to feeling as though this is not my concern. Yet you're here as an ally, flourishing. So do you maybe want to unpack what it was like inside those residences, how the movement made an impact, how it was received, and what you've seen some men's residences do to make a difference, if you have in any regard?
Sure, thanks for the brief introduction, Grace. So hi everyone, I'm Jacques and I'm second-time HOCO member at Men's Residence. So yeah, I'll start by just sort of explaining the process that occurred during the beginning phases of the movement. So initially we heard that there was this thing going on, this anti-GBV movement, and we as a HOCO were actually discussing it on our first HOCO camp. I believe that's the first time that we really sat down to properly discuss everything. And that was the same time that the memorandums were given to the men's raisers. So I think what counted in our favor was the fact that our race head and our prim were really quite, how can I say, they helped the HOCO to think through this in a very vulnerable way and in a very honest way. So we sat around and he literally asked us, how many of you guys think that this is nonsense and that we shouldn't listen to this, and you just don't care and you think we should ignore this? And he wanted us to be honest. He wanted us all to understand each other's perspectives and why we hold those perspectives. And then we had a few people saying like the kind of reservations that they had towards it, and others saying why they think we should support it. So we had that conversation in the beginning just to establish why some people think this is important and why some people don't think it's important as men. And then from there, when we'd already sort of established the things that we all agree upon, then we looked at the memorandum, went through each of the demands one by one, and basically said, okay, this is one that we can achieve immediately. This is an easy one. This one is a bit more difficult. This we might need to look at long term. And then this one, for example, we can have critical engagements on and sort of first get the input of the House before we start implementing this. So to just give some examples, something that we could change immediately would be some of the section names in men's races often have very inappropriate names. So like, for example, it would be alluding to certain sexual acts or be demeaning towards women, which could be offensive. So those are things that that we could just repaint immediately, like there's no discussion needed. And then there were other things that we had to think through a bit more thoroughly. So that would be more things related to traditions or cultures, like you said, which are things that, you can't necessarily change them immediately because they're a bit more pervasive, they're a bit more difficult and stubborn to change. So those are things that we had critical engagement on, like the explicit values and traditions, and how do our events and all of the things that we do, how do these match up to our values, and then also the higher values like the Constitution and so on. And then there were other things that we had to have further engagements on just within the whole course. So that would be like the getting a female advisor and those kinds of demands. So there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of engagement with the ideas, but there was also some resistance from the house. I think that was the most difficult thing, was communicating to the other men in the house why this is important, and how we can actually contribute to this movement without necessarily sacrificing things that are important to us, which, that was a very difficult process, because like you said, men easily feel attacked. And Teko, I really admire the empathy with which you stated all of the things about just the kind manner in which you represented the way that men's races feel. Like, it's not that they are all misogynists who hate women and that's why they don't want anything to change. That's not the case. A lot of them just misunderstand these things. They misunderstand the language that is used. When they hear rape culture, they immediately think that that's accusatory towards them as a person, instead of necessarily the broader culture and the broader way in which things are viewed. So those are just some thoughts. I think that was a bit chaotic now, but some of the things that I experienced being a hardcore member in a men's res, having to work through these issues. So I hope that gives some clarification at least.
This mute button and I are not friends. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate you just giving things from your side. And I think an important conversation that we should then delve into is student leaders and the relationship between student leadership and what happens with the students, right? Because there are numerous issues, especially given the historical background of Stellenbosch University, colonialism hub, chilling over there in the Cape. I think there was a protest in the Cape the other week about them wanting their own independence. A lot's going down over there on our campus. And I think the fact that student leaders have such an important role in ensuring and molding that when people come onto campus, there are certain facilities that are available to ensure that they have safe spaces to operate in. And I think that's where we get like VWare, who's going to work a lot in SRC doing the transformation things, more policy orientated. You get house committee members that basically indoctrinate certain cultures, for lack of a better word, into these first years as they walk in. This is how we do things in this residence, and if you don't do things in a certain way, then you're not part of our brotherhood or our sisterhood, whatever binary type of community that they're working in. And from that, I think student leaders have quite an essential role in ensuring that the message gets down to the people on the ground, because I don't know how else to say this, but we have a lot of conversations on campus, and it's quite easy for people to say, oh wow, it's that serious, oh I didn't know, and then pretend to be fascinated because it seems convenient for them to learn in that moment, and then move along like nothing's happening. So as equally as we can perpetuate and indoctrinate problematic cultures, should be as easy and as quickly as, albeit a little bit more time because there's things at home that you need to start undoing, but that same precedent of culture being educated and is entrenched the correct word? English is not my friend today. Being like promoted into people is really what we should be seeing from our student leaders. But there's two problems that I always see. Number one, sometimes student leaders themselves aren't willing to look beyond and ask for help. And so they think they're promoting the correct ideas, but they themselves don't really know what's hip and happening. And I think we've also got into a space at Stellies, this is very much my own personal opinion on this, where doing the bare minimum sometimes seems like we won gold medals at the Olympics when people just do the absolute, not even the bare minimum. Like they tried the bare minimum and they still failed at the bare minimum, but the fact that they thought of the bare minimum has become like amazing on Stellies. And I think that because of how problematic our spaces are, we've sort of just allowed people to get away with a lot in some aspects. And in other aspects, student leaders who maybe are more aware are giving these educational spaces, but because it hasn't been properly promoted, people aren't buying into it. And so I will have conversations with whoever, wherever I am, and they don't know this movement exists. And I'm like, guys, we are a national movement. We got 12,000 followers. We have campaigns. We were outside chanting outside your bedroom window. I know everyone's academics started sliding because this was like 2 weeks before finals. And you're telling me you don't know because your privilege just allowed you to not care. That's some hectic chats. And I think as student leaders, when there's so many different facets and ways that we need to filter down, get this culture, educate, I really want us to chat about the gap that is existing there. On firstly, when we have student leaders who just don't know what they're doing, so even when they tried, they're essentially failing and not really pushing the movement forward. And then in instances where we do have student leaders who are doing a lot to promote the values of the movement, there's a huge gap with how that's actually being received. And hence, when we go protesting outside Wardlaw, then we get egged on after saying, please, can you respect our fellow queer people on campus? So I don't know who wants to maybe continue that conversation on what are the types of mandates, duties, expectations, maybe the systems in which we elect student leaders. What do you think the role of how the movement feeds into student leadership really looks like on campus? I don't know, Howard, do you want to take that question maybe? I think you're HC, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, Teho, did you want to
everyone.
in there first?
I just want to say quickly that if anybody watching wants to ask questions, please feel free to do so in the chat section. Sorry, I tried to type it out, but I don't know how to. So I just wanted to say that quickly.
Thank you. You can also raise your hand if you're also struggling with the text, and then I'll try to slot in some questions there as well. Thank you so much, Teho. Howie, go for it.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm the incoming House Committee member for Critical Engagement and Women Empowerment, and I'm from the Tygerberg campus. And I think with regards to the election of student leaders, I think when you're coming into the job, you need to not be woke in the sense of, oh, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to know, okay, this is what rape culture is, so I'm going to try, okay, superficially not. No, guys, you have to educate yourself. That's one thing when I became a member of the Critical Engagement portfolio 2 years ago, I remember going into there with this blank slate of, I want to learn more about what are the social ills in our country, actually in our world, that we're facing, and how can we change this narrative and change these perceptions, as per se. And I know with regards to GBV, I know we've had a really unfortunate incident on Tygerberg where, apparently student leaders weren't doing enough, but guys, like faculty, the response was quite appalling. And I felt like in that sense of space and time, being virtually away from home, not being able to, go out there and say, we're trying our best. We're trying to virtually raise awareness. We're trying to say GBV is a social ill, and we're trying to educate people. But sometimes if you're trying to educate people and people just don't want to listen, it's the most difficult thing. Like I say, you can take a horse to a well, but you can't force it to drink. And sometimes that's where, I feel like I failed myself. But that's something that I want to go into this new term. And I know we've had a Haka camp where we've discussed about rape culture, GBV, and how we as a Haka can address this as a social justice. And I have more discussions with my fellow member for critical engagement and women empowerment planned forward, where we're going to have these conversations. We're going to bring this up in our day-to-day lives, especially on Tygerberg, because I sometimes feel we're a bit alienated from main campus because, we're so far away. So we're trying to collaborate more, to Sonke Justice, trying to find other initiatives where we can raise money for campaigns that work with GBV and work with victims of domestic violence. We're trying to garner awareness, because I feel like the more we are active on social media, because this pandemic has made us a more, I'd say, social media society, the more algorithms we create, the more people we can get involved, So that's something where I want to, try and address this matter that we are facing. I hope I answered your question.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. So definitely, obviously, we need better education and we need to get the values inside there. But what I really love is you pointing out the role of faculty. That's where the chats are. And I think Praise here in the comments said, I think like most reses have a drinking culture chat for newcomers, and it should be kind of compulsory to have one on consent. So let me introduce myself to y'all. I don't think I did that in the beginning. So at the end of my first year, when anti-GBV started, well, the movement really started to gain momentum. I was just a first year, like on a faculty committee, being a class rep and public relations, whoever, nothing big. But then in this past year, I worked in the SRC and I took the women empowerment managerial portfolio in the SRC, and I expanded that to women and queer empowerment. So I don't know if any of you guys follow Wake, but that was the initiative started there. And then over this next year, I'm planning to do some background things in my space as the Deputy Speaker Internal for Student Parliament. So the reason why I'm giving parts of my CV here is to discuss the fact that I've been engaging with management quite a lot. And now that I am no longer in Wake, I can spread all the tea. So I think faculty has a huge responsibility here. And after our memorandum was handed over to the directorate with all of those demands, they said this is way too big to do our long-term goals over just like some quick fix. So we're going to generate working groups. So I think there was one for security, one for residences, one for culture and awareness and education. And we had numerous working groups with designated members of faculty who were going to lead these conversations, and students could also join these working groups, give their opinions, and a huge report was going to be compiled, and all these reports were going to be put together to be handed over to rectorate on top. Like that's our vice chancellor and our top 6 over there. And a huge thing why the movement was slightly, well, a lot of members of the resistance, because we don't have like very rigid like leadership or hierarchy, whatever, it allows for a lot of internal discourse. So whenever I'm speaking of the movement, I am very much speaking from my perspective and the circle that I moved in. There was a huge amount of resistance because we've had the word task team become the most terrible word on campus you could ever think of. So a task team is essentially someone saying, this is a problem we've identified, we need to investigate this problem and come out with some solutions to make it happen, make the change happen after we've done our investigations. But those task teams have no binding power. So if your people on top don't follow through with the tangible mechanisms of how we're going to pull through with the findings that come out of these reports, then nothing really happens. And if I'm not mistaken, the working groups were really... Oh, Teko, did you want to add before I carried on?
I just wanted to make a comment on just the history of task teams in Stellenbosch, but also these working groups that were formed. Because I remember at some point in either this year or closer to the end of last year, a lot of people were asking, where are these working groups? What is happening with these working groups? What have they decided? That kind of thing. Because we weren't seeing much and we weren't hearing much. And I don't want to say it's anybody's fault that we weren't getting much information out of that, because as we know, these sorts of conversations do happen every once in a while, and some of the things that are discussed in those meetings can't necessarily be public information. But part of our issue with this task, with these working groups, was the lack of transparency, which is our biggest thing with the institution is we kept telling them the one thing we want is transparency, because as much as you can say you're going to do A, B, and C, we need to see that you're working towards doing A, B, and C. And I think at the first national protests we held this year as well in Johannesburg, we told the mayor's representative that if you want to do something, if you are going to do something, let us know. We're not saying that we don't trust you to do it. What we're saying is we need to see you do it. Do you get what I'm saying? And it was just saying, if you are going to pass the memorandum forward, CC us in that email and let us know this message has been forwarded to this next person, and this person's duty is this and this and this, that kind of thing. And that's not primarily, but one of the biggest things that we wanted to get from the institution, and what we felt like we weren't getting from them. And I think that this is a similar thing to what happened with the rape culture task team and that rape culture report, because it exists, it is there, and it's for us to use, but are we using it, And I think I mentioned this in a previous phone call with some of the people in this chat, that we are constantly, as the movement, trying to feed information into the institution, and not just the institution, but just the student body of Stellenbosch University, because there's no point in us saying we're a movement for the people if the people aren't involved in the learning processes and in everything that includes, getting these memorandums and getting these demands to management, right? So when we do have this information, when we give it to them, it's not like it's not available to them already, because they have this rape culture report, and it's clear that they just don't want to use it, or they're waiting for somebody to force them to use it. And I think so while someone commented, I think it might have been you, Grace, that how do we get these people to see that them talking isn't necessarily enough for us to be able to say that, you know what, you're doing something and we can see your work. I think there needs to be more what's the word, like more intent on how they they need to show their intentions a little bit more clearly, because you can have all the best intentions in the world, but if you're not putting them to work, and if you're not getting people involved who need to be involved, then what is the point,
Viva, do you want to add before I carry on?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to firstly from the something to mom about that is I feel like it's of the time.
Sorry, Viva, your connection's a little poor. Do you want to try speaking without your camera on? Maybe that'll make the connection slightly stronger.
Okay. Just let me know if I break off. Okay, so I was saying, on the point of lack of transparency, I think what frustrates students most is the fact that I don't think we're always in the loop as to what is happening and when that's happening. And I think for me, where it goes wrong then in our institution is that I find ways in which you can fix that problem, and then it goes through the channels, it goes through whoever it needs to go through, and then a couple of years later, we're told, okay, here's the outcome of the conversation we had. Here's the outcome of the memorandum you gave us. And then it becomes a back and forth that doesn't really have a proper, outcome that we can work with, because within that outcome, we then start identifying this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem. Whereas that could have been mitigated if we were part of the process, the decision making. That's why I always say it's not decision making, it's decision making processes, because there's steps that are taken essentially before a final decision is made. And one thing I always stress in meetings that I'm in with people that I interact with is that people, and students particularly, need to be a part of those decision-making processes. Yes, for transparency, but also just to save your own ass as an institution, so that when you do have a final outcome and you say, okay, this is the outcome of the rape culture report, or this is the final outcome of the work streams or the working groups or the task teams, whatever word they decide to use at the time, when they tell us that this is the outcome, it's an outcome that for once we're actually happy with, and it's one that can be implemented almost immediately because we knew what was happening. And then I also wanted to comment just pushing the I think a lot of the time we also take on a lot of responsibility as student leaders. I think we need to also
we lost you when you started the second point. Can you start your second point again for us, please? I'm so sorry, your connection broke there.
I was saying, I think also in terms of student leadership in movements such as anti-GBV and just movements in children transformation in general, we also are students, we're also young adults, we don't know everything. And I think the institution doesn't always equip skills that we need. They don't equip us the that we need to take a lot of the issues we actually have to face. And it's not for, I don't think, the institution doesn't have the resources themselves to equip us. I think something goes wrong and that information never really reaches the student leaders. And it needs to be a point where we say, have a critical engagement. This is the point of the engagement. This is what the outcome of this engagement is going to be. And this is the decision that's going to be taken. We can't always have conversations for the sake of educating, especially when it comes to issues of transformation, especially in an issue like anti-GBV. What I would love to see a lot of the House committees do is say, this is the memorandum. Our critical engagement today is going to be toxic masculinity. This is what we hope the outcome is going to be. And that's then going to feed the topic of conversation at our next House meeting. Something like that, that's practical, that's pragmatic, that is something, it doesn't always have to be drawn out. And I guess that's why I say there's a lot of different issues that feed into this, because at the same time, expecting House committee members to come up with an idea like that without being equipped with the knowledge, because some House committees, there's not a single one on that HALCA body who thinks like this. There's not a single one who cares enough. There's not a single one who maybe doesn't even, it's not that they don't care, but they don't know enough. And, it's because of the disparity in how the House committees are managed, not even led, and how they're managed institutionally, that we end up in a place where there's different races that are treating the newcomers differently. There's different races that are treating topics like anti-GBV differently. There's some races who we say are progressive, while there's other races who will constantly be, on the topic of being problematic.
%, Fiwe. I think I just want to comment from the perspective of someone who's lived in specifically Metanoia residence. And I probably shouldn't say that, but I think just for the sake of what I want to say, it's very important that I do. Metanoia residence is one of the first co-ed residences on campus. I think it's about 16, 17 years old. And it's seen as one of the most progressive, partly because it's co-ed, and Metanoia itself has put itself as well on that pedestal of being the progressive residence. Meanwhile, on the inside, I don't think that that's reflected, and I don't think a lot of people's experiences mirror that sentiment of living in a progressive space. I'm just speaking now from my own experiences. I think I was there for about 2.5 years. One of the things that we struggled with, especially as the Women Empowerment Committee, which I was part of for 2 years as well, was how do we get people to engage? Because a lot of the things were said at our House meetings, and during our section meetings, people would be like, yeah, we need to, combat rape culture. We need to start reassessing our actions and things like that. But when we do get to having those conversations about, like Viwe mentioned, when our HACAs or our committees say, this is the conversation we want to have today about what toxic masculinity is, what it looks like, how it manifests, and how it affects the student community at large, not just our residents and not just our sections, but the student community at large, and even bigger, the Stellenbosch community, because our campus is basically an open campus. Anybody can come on and off at any point in time, you know, and that's also part of the conversations that we need to be having. People weren't pitching. These conversations are happening, but it's always the same 7, 8 people who are coming to these conversations. And from a residence like Metanoia, where there's 500 people, 501 if I remember correctly, but like for a residence of so many people to have only 10 people pitch to a critical engagement session, it's an indicator of how these people feel. And I mean, obviously not everybody can pitch to everything every time because, you know, schedules differ, people are busy. But I think as students who live in that residence space, at some point you do need to prioritize these conversations, because within our residence, we've had several incidences of people being stalked to their rooms, people waking up with people in their rooms, you know, that kind of thing. And I just feel like maybe this isn't the leader's problem, obviously not, because, you know, you can only do so much, as how I said, you can, you know, but the culture of these residences is to sweep things under the carpet. And that's not just Metanoia, that is the Stellenbosch community as a whole. But it makes no sense for you as a resident with such a big moniker to now not hold your students accountable when they don't pitch to those things, or to not engage with them on why is it that you're not pitching to these things, because a lot of the people who plan these things are also very stigmatized. The residence heads, or the people who organize, or the people in students affairs, they will look at these people who organize these conversations as if they're trying to cause turmoil within the residence. They're trying to, you know, disrupt the status quo, when that's not even that's not what people are trying to do. All we're trying to do is ensure that people feel safe in their living spaces, you know. And that's literally, like Grace said, the barest of the minimum. It's literally the smallest things that we can do to ensure people feel safe.
Thanks, Tepo. So I think, yeah, okay. So all the I think Viwe and Tepo covered a lot about what I wanted to go over. So thank you so much. I think, so whenever I talk about management, there's something inside me that just needs to calm down so that I don't lose my cool while I'm here, because there are two reports that I personally made over the past 6 months, because I think as members of the movement, we try to take the values of the movement into whichever work we do and try to make a lifestyle of it to ensure that the values that we're engaging with happen in the spaces that we're involved with. Hence us putting, you know, someone who ran as the prim of a residence still has the duty to ensure that gender-based violence is combated, even though their duties in the Constitution don't necessarily outline it, because it's something you need to carry through in all the spaces that you're in. So two things that I worked, two of the reports that I wrote. One was me calling out certain members of management in their complacency, calling out the fact that we get a lack of training as student leaders, and yet management is so quick to say all the time, no, well, you know, you student leaders, you don't tell us things we didn't know. You knew, the memo told you. Calling out the fact that, you know, the duties always put on us. We're so disappointed in the failure of leadership at Hayes Mare that we're considering just tearing down the residence. For context, there's a very problematic men's residence on campus, and there was like a quick second where they were going to cancel the res and just start a new res in its space because the leadership structure had failed to combat that gender-based violence. But if management never engaged to train the leaders on how to change things, then they're going to go off of their own understanding of how to generate that change. So you're perpetuating a cycle. So numerous issues on like management's failure to engage with all the holes and the gaps that exist within resident spaces. And the second one was a proposal is the word I'm looking for. I was going to say proposition, but then that sounded weird. So proposal to the Stellenbosch Transformation Forum to say, you know, we really need compulsory training on equity and gender-based violence to members of faculty themselves. Because I've got lecturers who walk in and say, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And in the first 3 seconds of me meeting you, I know you exist in a binary. And I know that my non-binary friends sitting next to you, people who don't feel comfortable with the way that gender norms have been created, automatically feel excluded. You just walk in and you greet the class, and I know that 10% of that room automatically feels excluded. You know, so chats along those lines really need to be delved in. Faculty needs their own formal training. And secondly, these compulsory conversations, as Praise is highlighting, about what is gender-based violence, we need more of them. And I understand it's triggering, but if you can have 2 hours on what is safe drinking culture when you sneak in your booze at Fensters, I really think we can talk about, you know, how do we respect our women and queer bodies on campus. Both of these remain the title of proposal. And the reason why it's staying so stagnant and why it's taken long that I spent all this time doing research, coming up with pragmatic solutions, and it's gone nowhere, is because of campus bureaucracy. And Shan, I'm not entirely sure how involved you were in terms of structures. I know you're part of Wits Activate, so when you give your introduction, maybe you're aware of how bureaucracy works at an institution. But I've never met a student leader on any campus say that they have put something forward and it's come out well because campus just took an hour to listen. So Shan, I really love like your understanding here, maybe from an outsider's perspective. Yes, that's why I called you up, sis. I see you. To delve in what bureaucracy, why is it there? Because it gives so much unnecessary stress. And just like generally from an outsider's perspective, how student leaders engage with management and have that more top down, more so than just the general grassroots type of activism that us as a movement work on. Do you want to comment on that, Shannon?
Do I want to comment on that. Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Shannon. I'm independently on this panel tonight. I'm a Wits student and I work in the anti-femicide movement, but with a bunch of different organizations. People just throw me around whenever they need me and then whack me to the next one. So I really have like a bit of spread of knowledge there. And also my highest capacity at Wits University is I've been the vice chairperson of Activate, which is our LGBT society. So I have also been a part of these management discussions, had a seat on at the table to kind of look at the transformation of campuses and what we can do at universities. I think like speaking, I'm not just going to speak about Wits because I think we're having a discussion about like generally what are we doing as like campus movements and how do we expand our work beyond, you know, our small circles. Something I want to like point out is that the experiences that I have with Wits, and I can assume a lot of people from different universities would say the same, are glaringly similar. We have a lot of the same issues with res culture. We have a lot of the same issues with management. We have a lot of the same issues with drinking culture. And if you're a university that has a different drinking culture to the next one, then your experiences and how you manage your campus and how you educate people is going to be different. And obviously, as much as it seems glaringly obvious that throughout res culture in general, it's just problematic, there's still different traditions. They come from different reasons. And so they have like different support behind them. So when you're like, you're taking this either from a structural or a grassroots approach, right? You either already have a seat at the table because you have some kind of authority from being a CSO, from being a part of the SRC of your university, or you're a outside grassroots organization that doesn't necessarily have that access or hasn't been officiated, right? You're going to be approaching that in a different way. I think the first thing that needs to be stressed when looking at that structural issue is that university managements don't just make things bureaucratic because of some important reason to their process and to the way they see things. It is glaringly obvious that they're unwilling to engage with these movements and they're unwilling to actually do the work and change the structures. They like things the way they are to some extent, or else they would override those processes like they do for just about anything else in order to make the necessary changes, in order to bring about what's some of the examples: sensitivity training, access to resources, making the processes more victim focused. These are things that people well before me and well beyond me are going to be screaming about to management, and making management have to publicly take that pledge and publicly announce that they're going to be working on this means that we can start a much more broader sense of accountability, right? So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is merging those two stances. I've talked about structural approaches and I've talked about grassroots, but grassroots organizations exist, and I think that there's something to say about how this looks at other universities. So at Wits University, we don't necessarily have something like the anti-GBV movement in Stellenbosch. We have Black Women Caucus, and they do a lot of great external work as a CSO, but they don't necessarily do the campus work that you guys do. A lot of the gender and transformation work either falls into the GEO, which is a WITS institution and is thus accountable to WITS, not accountable against WITS or moderating WITS. We have the SRC, who there's a lot to say about, like, the way we elect student leaders at different universities and different campuses. I think, like, firstly, we don't necessarily have a voting system that implements intersectionality from what I've seen in my experiences, and I think that you guys could also speak on if that's something that you get as well, which means that the representation that you get isn't something that you necessarily want, and that means it's not going to, like Grace said, make this a lifestyle of, at every meeting, am I going to bring up how are we going to adjust policy or implement this in a way that's safe for women? If we're talking about on-campus events, are we thinking about how this is going to be a protected space for women and protected space for queer individuals, etc.? You know, you have to, in my experience, it's usually a woman or a queer or a trans individual who is asking those questions, because you don't necessarily have people taking up that on their own, right? And that lack of intersectionality in student leaders means that you don't get consistency, right? You get high levels of mobilization behind anti-on-campus GBV when voting comes around, and then we don't necessarily see that conversation the rest of the year, and we also just don't have the transparency to know what's happening behind closed doors and what those conversations are even looking like. So that role of student leaders is glaringly the same across campuses, and I want to bring that into this. So what's then the solution? I think to some extent officiating grassroots organizations, it's something that needs to be, like, looked into. I think that you guys, from an outsider perspective, have a lot more weight than other universities on campus grassroots organizations. And once you get even to that status of being officiated as a CSO, like the way Activate is, that you're actually associated with the university, there's a lot that you then have access to, right? You have the ability to campaign to members to sign up. You have space in orientation programs, which means that you can guide sensitivity training, you can guide res culture. It means that you have access to funding, or at least access to advocate for funding, and you get some level of respect from the university, which means that it's going to be a lot easier to hold them accountable. I think that that's something that needs to be solidifying and institutionalizing our grassroots organizations across different campuses is important. And once we do that, we can also then address what are the differences in our environments and in our CSO is just a club, society, or an organization. Sorry, we have different lingo, different campuses, different universities. Yeah, just a club or a society or an organization, but one that, like, you can sign up members for and is associated with the university. But yeah, so, and once you then have more solidified grassroots organizations that are on-campus organizations, you can do work outside of campus, but that is meaningful because then you are then addressing not the national crisis of GBV, which you should still take part in and do your part in, but you can say, here are these specific things at my university that are contributing to a rape culture or is contributing to a lack of consent culture or whatever it is, and you can target those rather than just looking at the broader specifics about education. I think universities don't realize that they, as a space, have a unique way of enabling rape culture, have a unique way of enabling gender-based violence. When they have it on campus, they say this is part of society's issues, so we're going to leave you up to the police, we're going to leave you up to your community. It's not our responsibility because this isn't our problem. But they should actually start to notice that as a problem. And I think empowering grassroots organizations is the first step to make them do that. Okay, I gotta stop talking now.
No, that was perfect. Tejo, I see your hands up. Just before, I just want to say a quick sentence that I don't know about other campuses, but what has really frustrated me and why I'm loving this conversation so much is because we can see the types of spaces that we as the movement now need to fill as we're going about to our second year, is the fact that the campus has made it such a strategic way of making us as students ourselves become bureaucratic. So now it's got, like they've got a double bureaucratic system because you're explaining what a society, we don't have CSO, we just have societies who all sit on a societies council, right? So all the different organizations sit on a board. And technically, societies council should have the same amount of power as PIACA, which is our prim committee, which is all the residence head student leaders sitting together, because both of those members of the different organizations sit and feed into their chairperson, and both those chairs sit in the SRC. But you look at societies, people don't know what the definition of a society is. So I don't think, I talk about societies fair and they're like, oh, that's space in orientation week where I got a free Coke on the field. And I'm like, sis, did you not look around you? And even more so than that, the lack of backing and the undermining that exists within us, where we need to ask each other and we don't even know about the type of management systems that already exist to help us, just allows for perpetuation of our bureaucracy going in circles before we need to start hitting their bureaucracy, which is basically, no, that's the equality unit, no, that's transformation unit, no, that's student affairs, no, that's student governance. And I'm like, guys, you're the same person with the same objective. But yeah, fully agree. I just wanted to add that it's not only within us up to management, but us within ourselves, which is a deep chat that we should also unpack. Tejo, did you want to carry on?
So just to respond to the officiating of grassroots organizations on campus, specifically with the anti-GBV movement, I know that was a conversation that was had. I don't know if that was in this year or last year. Sorry, my perception of time is non-existent. But basically that was a conversation that was had. But again, our biggest issue was that we would be held liable to the university's bureaucracy and to their levels of having to go through certain channels to achieve certain objectives. And that's exactly what we didn't want to do, because what we wanted was to be able to stand from the outside and say, the university is supposed to serve its students in this and this way, and it's not doing that. And not to say that you can't as a society, but it is harder as a society because you depend on these people for funding. And I noticed that with Queer Us, I think Shannon and I mentioned it probably once or twice in our conversations as Queer Us, that Queer Us does not get the support on campus that it should. It does not have the same access to funding that other societies do, and partly because the university views it as a drinking society, and it is upset with the fact that yeah, I mean, I could go into that, but like, we'll speak about that a little bit later. But basically, it's the university has a way of looking at certain societies and certain organizations on campuses as being more worthy of existing on campus and being more worthy of their attention on campus than others. And we didn't want that to happen to Anti-GBV because we have a very clear mandate, a very big and important mandate that we have to reach and that we have to push forward, because without us, to some extent, progress is slow to non-existent. So that's one thing. But also, oh, okay, well, I lost my train of thought. So I'll just speak about what I wanted to a little bit later.
Thank you so much. And as you're saying that, I'm being reminded of Shannon talking about the fact that we need more intersectionality within our student leadership and how there's some really shady things happening there. And I even think about the lack of intersectionality within those managerial systems to begin with. I mean, we've had people, het cis white Christian men who have held those positions for longer than we've had democracy, and already clogging up spaces when they themselves are unwilling to engage. And it's yeah, maybe I should stop talking.
I just want to, okay, so first of all, I want to comment on that note about our management and how they lack intersectionality, and not necessarily that they lack intersectionality, because we have seen, although like the majority of Stellenbosch University management is cis-het white males, we do have quite a few women of color, we do have quite a few men of color in pretty important positions. But I think one thing, not just as anti-GBVSU, but as activists, that we need to remember is that having someone that you see as a minority in a space will not always guarantee that that person is looking out for minorities. And I think that that's the thing that we need to be more careful with looking at in terms of navigating our activism. So there's that, but also I think, Howard, maybe you can now comment on this, because the way that management handled the Tygerberg case of assault, violence earlier on this year, when a student was assaulted by another student. And I think a lot of people think that we've forgotten about the Justice for Liver case, and we really haven't. Because the way that that was handled said a lot to us as Stally students, and it said a lot to the country, because a lot of people were looking into this case and looking for justice for, just to see how management basically sent students on a runaround, and they made students take charge of their own justice, and they made us find our own ways to hold this person accountable and then continue to help that person, which, I mean, I guess obviously because not all students are from the Western Cape, to some extent, I guess there is a little bit of responsibility for that person in that sense. But at the same time, it's like this person has violated another person's rights, you know, and what you're doing is telling us that you need to speak to another person to be able to clarify that it's okay for you to hold them accountable for their actions. That's what we were getting from a lot of the communication that we were receiving from students on Tygerberg campus. And just speaking to, yes, Shannon, this is what I wanted to say. You mentioned how universities have a unique way of fostering rape culture and perpetuating rape culture. And I think this is one of those incidents that showed that that is exactly what these places do, because we felt like we had nobody in our corner. We had nobody to say, Level, it's okay, to nobody to say anti-GBVSU, how do we help you? You know, to Tygerberg students, they had to go fetch their own management, their own faculty members to be like, you need to stop this. People who are guilty of assault should not be, like, they should not be eligible to be doctors, where they have this constant access to people, to women, to children, to queer people, who they can then make victims of their violence again and again and again. So I just think, just in terms of management being complicit and in terms of management not communicating enough, the communication between students in that specific scenario and management was almost non-existent. They were constantly telling us, no, we need to speak this to this and this and this person, and then coming back with like a 2-liner email about what they have done or what they have said. So Howard, if you can, or if you feel comfortable to discuss that situation, please do.
Tejo, I think you've summed it up very, very well. And, in terms of what has been done, we still haven't heard anything about it, and we really don't know what faculty has finally decided for the perpetrator, So it's kind of frustrating because you want to hold our management structures accountable, and at the moment we've not heard much about that. But otherwise you've discussed it really, really well.
Thank you so much. And I think so. A next important conversation that we need to have. So we've been talking for over an hour. I didn't even realize, but we're running with it. It's so weird for me to think that when you look at how bureaucratic systems work and the fact that essentially everyone is blaming each other on who has power, at this point, I honestly think like you could call Uncle Cyril himself directly and nothing. So I don't even know who is this magical person. They keep saying the university won't help us, and I'm like, you are the university to help us. They're acting like a juristic person is a natural person. It can get quite frustrating. So one of the meetings I had with our head of student affairs once was essentially unpacking how do we hold members accountable. And I want to unpack this because the answer I was given was essentially everyone has a boss. So just keep going up until you find the boss's 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 boss in HR, and eventually you'll see some form of accountability. This is particularly relating to the fact that we weren't given a response as to what happened after the investigation surrounding Mr. Cornelius Gareth on campus. And just numerous other members of management who complaints were, yeah, girl, my position's gone, I'm spilling all the tea. And just for context, there was a head of the same Metanoia residence that Tejo was in, who also happened to be one of the head coordinators of residences. And there was an allegation against him that when someone came forward and said, I have a perpetrator in this residence, it was alleged that he encouraged the victim to leave the res if she felt uncomfortable staying with the perpetrator instead of kicking the perpetrator out of the residence space. Numerous
Can I
other
just
allegations.
correct that? Can I correct that?
Yes.
Because not only is this a very personal case because I know the victim, but it's personal because I was also assaulted in Metanoia residence. So Gareth represents a lot for me, and I think I mentioned it to him at one of our protests. I told him, okay, well, let me rather not because I'm still trying to study. Anyway, but what was said, I'm going to say allegedly because what was allegedly said was that the student went to Gareth about the incident, and when the student said to Gareth, I don't feel comfortable with this person, can you suspend him? Can you remove him from his leadership duties? That kind of thing. Go to the equality unit first because the equality unit has to find proof that this has actually happened. Go to this, you need to report it to the police as well so that we know that it's actually a case and something that has happened. And then when the equality unit found that person guilty, Gareth said, well, Gareth allegedly said, you've lived with him for this long, surely you can still live with him on. So when you hear things like that from people who are meant to protect you within your own living space, when you hear that from people who you're meant to go to about these issues on campus, what else do you do? Where can you go? Because clearly Gareth is being protected by a lot of the people who are in management positions, who are in, HR positions. And I don't know how this looks for men's residences. I hope, Jacques, that you can come in a little bit here because I know a lot of people as well in certain men's residences, I don't want to name because, don't want to give people away, that have been victims of violence. And because it's a men's residence, it's looked at like it's not a big issue. Like, bro, it's literally just bro culture. That's literally what it is. It's bro culture. You can live with it, continue, move on. It's not a big deal. And just to have those people look at our situations and be like, it's not that big of a deal. While you're already processing certain forms of trauma, to be re-traumatized and just traumatized anew by someone invalidating your experience is, for me, it's the fuel that keeps me going, because there is no way the people that are meant to keep me safe are adding to my trauma. So Jacques, basically my question is to you, how do you think cases of assault and just cases of even microaggressions in men's residences are handled? And furthermore, what would you like to see the university do to, this sounds very stupid, but to resensitize men? Because it seems like a lot of men's residences are desensitized from the actual impacts of these incidents. And I think, sorry, I'm getting a little bit emotional, but I think that part of the issue with the way that things have been addressed, with the way that GBV has been addressed nationally, is that we've taken focus away from victims, and we've taken focus away from people who are living these realities, who are going through these things. And we've decided to look at statistics. We've looked at GBV as the thing, you know, and not as people who are experiencing the thing. So yeah, that's basically my question, is how do men's residences experience some of the things that I've mentioned?
Cool. Thanks so much for the question, Seho. I obviously can't speak like on behalf of all men's residences, because I've only experienced one of them in only the capacity of a HC member. So yeah, I can't really generalize that much. And I also don't want to sort of paint the stereotype of men, but I do think there is some merit in saying that, you know, in general, men are at least perceived to be less open when it comes to disclosing abuse. I think it's a cultural thing as well, that we're conditioned into not speaking about experiences of victimhood that we've had, and minimizing experiences of victimhood in men when we hear about those things. So that's just the continual perpetual cycle. And to be honest, that's a tough one. Sure, I don't think I can actually think of a solution now, just off the top of my head. But thank you for raising that question, because I definitely think that is something that we should be looking into. And I think I'll just echo some of the things that Grace has been saying about equipping student leaders to be aware of these things, because I think just that will already go a long way. If we're aware of the fact that men can be victims too, and there should be a way to handle that, which is, which is fair to the victims, and which emphasizes their rights, their needs, their protection, and not, this culture that we currently have of, oh, well, are men even victims? Like, does that even happen? Or when it happens, oh, that's just boys will be boys, I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I'll definitely still think a lot about what we can do personally in our space. At least I can't now speak for everyone, but so sorry that I can't offer any kind of solutions, but it is a pervasive issue. It's something that's very complex, and it's something that we all have to work towards understanding better and seeking solutions.
Thank you so much, Jacques. And I think part of the reason you're probably having a difficult time coming up with a solution is because it's an entire shift in culture. It's not like there's one particular person that whose door we can knock on. It's an entire culture shift that happens. And when you look at the stereotypical person at Stellenbosch, I was going to say some bad things now. Okay, but when you look at a stereotypical Stelly student, and I was going to say something problematic involving flip-flops, but I'm not going to go down that road. But when you look at the stereotypical Stelly student, you see, I think this is a conversation I was having with Viwe and Teho earlier. It's a lot of people who come from very close communities, and within those close communities have a fuck ton of privilege. And when you look at these two overlapping factors, right? When we're in Stellies, it's become increasingly difficult for ignorance to be an excuse. So the conversation I want to start leading us towards is really solution-based in terms of accountability, because this is always a difficult thing, because we see so many nice things get told to us. We get so many emails being sent to us. I lie. We don't get a lot of emails being sent to us because that means they had to care. But on the rare occasion where we put enough media pressure on them to give us something, then we're not entirely sure on what's happening thereafter. So if we go back to the stereotypical Steli student, being of an immense amount of privilege, I think we are one of the most privileged campus, socioeconomically speaking, most privileged campuses in South Africa from at least a public perspective, public institution perspective, not necessarily as a private institution. We know that these resources are there. I think our vice rector is the second highest vice rector in South Africa, just under UNISA's. I think Mr. de Villiers brings home like 4 mil a year, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, it's millions a year. We've got fargas upon nargas upon how many other learning centers. So for students themselves, when ignorance is becoming less and less of an excuse, we've got institutions like Queer Us. It sucks that we need societies to have portfolios called education when it shouldn't be their burden. That's just my personal take. Like, why does Queer Us need to now go educate the masses? Surely you should just be a safe space hub. But now yours must be triggering yourselves by going into the men's residences to tell them to not be problematic when you're supposed to be a safe space society. It's just cycles upon cycles of madness. I think firstly, we need to unpack how do we hold students accountable, because, you know, something as small as catcalling, you can't tell me you didn't know that was problematic. Like, you can't tell me. You are a final year BCom student, you living there with your Mac and your matching Apple Watch, and I see you on Instagram posting your pictures of you at BOHOS during a pandemic. So surely you can follow one feminism account and know that catcalling is problematic. Secondly, how do we hold management accountable? Because it's always the fact that someone can blame someone else on who's boss, and for some reason some people lower have more power than some people above, and if they themselves can't see how something is problematic, then it now becomes burdensome that 18-year-olds to 22-year-olds, someone literally a third of their age, must now explain to them. So it's not very nice to say that this is the role that all women need to take. I feel crazy. Like, I genuinely feel like I am crazy. So the next chat that I really want to unpack, I don't know if Shan, maybe you just want to look at this from an external point of view, or if you guys want to look structurally inside the different spaces, then maybe Jacques or Hawa. I don't see Viwe anymore. I'm just assuming there's a problem with the connection, because she was complaining about that earlier.
She did say that her connection has been giving her issues, so apologies for her having to leave so suddenly, but she hopes the conversation goes well.
Thank you so much. So I think let's look both externally and internally how we hold students accountable, how we hold management accountable, and how the burden has now been placed on a movement that the only time the police will bother to remove a perpetrator from a space is if we start a live and start 3 petitions and 2 hashtags trending on Twitter just for that perpetrator to get 500 rand bail. So let's get some thoughts on the different mechanisms of accountability and the different spaces that we need that accountability to exist. I don't know who's got some thoughts if they want to start that on. Shan, I'm poking you. Maybe from like an external perspective, when we look at like judicial offices, I think I recently saw a newspaper article on a judge that was giving light sentences to perpetrators. So let's maybe start externally, and then we can come back to the movement on campus, because we did have quite a few national protests this year, which I'm super excited about how national anti-GBV has gone. So yeah, maybe Shannon, do you want to unpack accountability on a bigger scale, and then we'll go back to campus?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things I want to maybe like question and unpack, right? There's firstly a lot of responsibility that's placed on people who have taken up these positions that are supposed to be fulfilling the role of dealing with either on campus or off campus gender-based violence. So like for us being in our capacity organizers to some extent, people who are taking up structural positions for organizations, whether on campus or off campus, and just like any leadership role, right? There's a lot of I don't want to say pressure, but there's just a lot of responsibility that's placed on us to do the work, to educate the masses, and also unpack a lot of structural issues that we don't necessarily have access to. We have to be able to get mass amounts of input in order to have a clear view of what we're actually dealing with, and then take on the steps to mobilize. So I think that like the accountability is really empowered by the strength in regards to that, right? Because you're going to get the best accountability from that sort of power. So I think reinforcing what I said earlier, because I don't necessarily have a lot to say that's different. Like, so reinforcing what I said earlier about management needs to have to be engaged, or whoever is whoever you're pressuring, right, externally, then expanding that conversation, needs to be engaged on like, to what extent are you actually involved with supporting this movement, right? I think glaringly obvious is we had a 10-day period of silence, or like moments of silence or solidarity in South Africa that Cyril put in place.
Warning for GBV
and
COVID victims.
And COVID victims.
And COVID.
And in the meantime, we had ANC members reinstated who had been committing heinous crimes against children and forms of violence that I don't necessarily want to say out loud. So in that regard, like, to what extent is it our responsibility to engage people who are not going to give those resources in the first place, who are not supportive of the movement, and how do we get either we get them on that side or engage them through that discourse and that conversation? Like Grace, you were talking about people, we have to be like half people's age, telling them how things should actually look to create safe spaces. Or do we move away from that? And then where do we find those resources? Where do we find that access to policy work, funding, things like that? And there are a lot of larger NGOs that we don't necessarily have access to as grassroots organizations, big national ones, just as an example, I think. But then also, because of that, a lot of this is now more than the external points that you perhaps want to bring up. Because of that, a lot of our work then moves to online activism and protesting. And those spaces need to be as meaningful as possible and empower their spillover way past that one time. You never want a movement to be associated with one protest or one post that goes viral online, you know? You never want that to be. You want that consistency. You want that mobilization to have consistent growth and consistent discourse. So in that regard, just constantly assessing that space and making sure it's intersectional and it's meaningful is something that's definitely helpful to that form of accountability, because then you have constant pressure, then you have constant changing discourse, but then you also have that movement growing. That's a form of accountability. But then I think moving away from like grassroots organizations, now let's look at us as individuals. We all have a form of capacity in our life. We're a family member, we're university students, we're classmates. In that regard, I think there's some personal responsibility that needs to be discussed about, like, do we hold people accountable that we see their statuses on Instagram, as Grace loves to point out people's statuses on Instagram. Do we hold those people accountable, and what form do we use in that in regards to that accountability? You know, is it direct? Is it maybe speaking on our experiences and making that something more meaningful? That's maybe like what I want to like better question with the external. Yeah.
So I just want to make a comment on the responsibility of the individual or the organization on campus versus the responsibility of the institution itself. And I think I mean, this is definitely a bigger conversation that I'm about to get into, but just one of the things that a lot of people forget is that we are, as university students, there to obtain degrees, but a lot of people think that not studying a BA degree or not studying an arts degree or a human sciences degree means that you have to be logical, and they equate being logical with lacking empathy. And I think one of the ways in which the country as a whole can start to address gender-based violence is looking more into holistic learning. Because I know a lot of engineering students that just straight up do not understand the concept of not of men are trash. They just straight up don't understand that men are trash isn't looking directly at men as individuals, you know, but at a societal problem. They're looking at patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and a lot of people think that because they're studying things like BAC and, you know, your B-Eng and your B-Coms, you don't need to understand what critical thinking is. And I think that that is part of our problem. And I know that is also something very privileged to say, because not everybody does have access to a university level education, but in all our learning institutions, I think that that should be a priority, is to teach people how to think beyond themselves and to think beyond what they themselves think and feel. Does that make sense? Because you aren't no person is an island. You're not born alone and die alone. You're born of someone, and you go into the world to interact with other people, you know, and just simply learning how to treat people and how to coexist with your different opinions is one of the biggest things that we all need to learn how to do, you know. And just now I'm thinking specifically for those people who think logic is lacking empathy. I think that's also part of why toxic masculinity is a thing, is because men think that being logical, a lot of men think that being logical is, again, lacking empathy. And they only start to realize the depth of a situation as soon as it becomes personal to them. And just going back again to say that part of addressing these issues is on the institution to teach people that it doesn't have to be your mother, your sister, someone's brother, someone's sister, someone's uncle. It's just a whole nother person on this planet whose rights are also just as valuable as your own. And just speaking on continuity and being able to keep momentum, I think I mentioned earlier in our call with Grace and Viewer, just on structuring this conversation, is that a lot of people want to talk about performative activism and what passive activism is. And I think a lot of people undermine the impact of these things. And I'm not saying that as someone like who's always believed that, like, you know, this and this and this, but just having gone back and thought about what someone said, is that there's no such thing as activism that isn't completely performative. Because even in being performative, somebody is going to see what you're saying, somebody's going to see what you're doing, the work that you're alluding to, and someone's taking it to heart. You know, someone is looking more into what you said, someone is going to try to find out, either from you or from somewhere else, what exactly it is you meant by what you're saying. And I think we also, just speaking on microactivism, is we need to not undermine our very small acts of activism, our very small acts of, you know, calling a spade, because if someone's catcalling you, they're harassing you, you know. And we need to not be afraid of using those words, because a lot of people are like, well, I'm not that man, I'm not that monster, because they don't see what they do as acts of violence, when in reality they are, just on a smaller scale, on a more micro scale. So if you're gonna catcall me, you realize that it's harassment. If you're groping me, it's assault. You're touching me without my permission. And I think that we need to go away from minimizing, and I think that this goes back to the language that we use, is very important. It's key to furthering these conversations, because when you say that you've assaulted me, someone thinks they've violently R-worded you, or they've violently, you know, pushed you into a thing. But no, you've touched me without my permission after I've said no to you. You've made me do something that I didn't want to do because you felt like I should be doing it, those kinds of things. And I think that in holding each other accountable, I think we also need to start to, and not to say tone police people, but to call a spade a spade. If something is wrong, it's wrong. And even if that means that we need to look at ourselves now as people who do have these big platforms and have maybe transgressed someone in the past or whatever it is, we can be able to say, you know what, that was actually really fucked up. I shouldn't have done that. And this is me learning. This is me putting into action what I've been preaching for so long and what I have learned along the way. And that's not to say someone's collateral damage is my learning experience. No, but it's to say that I have gone through this, I have done this, and you know what? I do want to be better than what I was in that moment. So I did speak in circles, but I hope that some of what I've said makes sense.
Yeah, I think Shannon and I had the same thoughts, so I'm going to let Shannon speak before I jump onto that.
Okay, yeah, definitely, because this is still a conversation about accountability. I think like what Techo's really stressing is that form of self-accountability, right? At the point where you're joining this movement in whatever capacity it is, and you're taking on that role, we need to, as a community, constantly engage the discourse of like what is meaningful activism, what even is activism, what is intersectional activism, what is mobilization, and that. And allowing for that discourse means that you can, as an individual, take on that journey of self-accountability. So you might start out in online activism or slacktivism, microactivism, whatever you want to call it, because maybe that's just what you believe you have access to, or what you know how to do, or like just what fits into your life right now. But any well-intentioned person is going to constantly engage their actions and be like, is this meaningful? Is this the role I want to take on? Is there more that I can do? Is there more spaces that I can engage with? And then when you're forming a part of that journey and you're keeping yourself accountable, right? The activism that you do as part of the anti-femicide movement now is going to be different to the activism you're going to do a year from now and a year from then, right? The one thing you just have to maintain is that you should always be open to that discourse. You should be open to learning. You should be open to growing, right? And you should also be enabling that discourse for other people. So that's even when that's then maybe expanding that idea about like keeping our circles and our capacity accountable. It's not just about calling out people, it's just about maintaining a space of constantly challenging the norms and constantly engaging with what should be different in our society.
Absolutely. And I think just like one more level of what I wanted to add, because we're here, is basically that I think when we define activism, because I don't know about you guys, but I get a lot of messages quite often saying, hey, Grace, what can I do? Or hey, Grace, how can I be a better activist or whatever? And personally, the word activism in my personal capacity just freaks me out. But that's a different chat for a different day. And I think one of the important reasons why is because we haven't delved into, as a movement, everyone who says that they form part of the movement has essentially said that they are an activism in their spaces. And when we define activism and the various forms that it exists in, we can't peg like mobilizers who give big speeches on the Roy Plain as being the only form of activists that exist within our spaces. I think activism needs to be extended to any once you've made it a lifestyle to always bring things into conversation, to always ensure that whenever you see an issue, you are willing to make yourself be slightly uncomfortable. Because, I mean, the point of activism is the fact, like, fuck the norms, because clearly the norms are not working for us. If something as simple as reposting something on your status, and you know that your followers are made of majority hetero white men who feel uncomfortable, if just reposting something on your story is going to shock the type of people that you have given a form of activism that is quite uncomfortable for you, and you going out that zone is a lot. for someone like me, where I know my followers, most of them think like me. I think like 80% of my followers are quite leftist. When I repost something, it's more because I expect people to expand on the knowledge that they already have, not that they're going to be in entire disagreement. You know, maybe there'll be conversations surrounding mechanism on, is this necessarily the best mechanism to reach that end goal? But whether or not GBV is a conversation we should be having is not it's not debatable for most of my space. And so me reposting something on my story isn't a huge form of activism for me, because I don't personally think, knowing my reach and being realistic with my reach, I don't think I'm making as big an impact as I could. But me coming here, me writing policy and going up to the structures in management, that makes me uncomfortable. That's pushing me. That's some form of policy activism that we're going into. That's where I feel I'm going into a difficult space, and I'm challenging the space, and I'm making myself uncomfortable. So we need to also stop this like blanket idea of what is an activist, what is a member of the movement, how do we develop that change, because it is quite relative. But my saying of 2020 has really been, just don't be stagnant. Like literally just don't be stagnant, like just don't do nothing. And within you doing something, make sure it's something that you know is impactful relative to your experience, because we all are in different spaces, and if we're going to measure a yardstick of what activism looks like, what mobilizing looks like, based on constant comparisons to other people or other organizations, we're going to completely miss the nuances of what every little bit helps really means. And that's when movements start to get undermined. People's internal discourse start to become fights, instead of us just realizing that we've got different mechanisms to achieve the same outcome and should be supporting each other. So maybe you reposting sign this petition is a big deal to you, and me like click change the link, click sign the petition meant nothing. Like obviously I understand it's got a big impact, but it wasn't very difficult for me in my position, because it's like everyday logic, just sign the petition. Just because we're really pushing forward in our channel and lane of how we're going to define what our mechanism of activism in this moment, and as Shan's highlighted, constantly changing as our circumstances changing, rightfully so, doesn't necessarily exclude us from the fact that we need to support other people. So if Tejo, for example, right now is saying, I'm going to convene things, doesn't now, because I'm doing policy, mean that I shouldn't pitch up to protest. Which is also a conversation Shannon and I were having the other day. So really it's about finding your mechanism of activism to feed into the whole movement, and from there where you can to assist the other forms of activism that other people have decided to specialize in, for lack of a better word, within the circumstances they find themselves in. Tejo, did you want to expand on that?
Not necessarily expand, but just bring this back to specifically the Stellenbosch context, because I think a lot of the time Stellenbosch students feel like we don't have the power to enact change because we can't constantly be protesting and meeting the same responses from our management. And I'm not too sure how this goes on Tygerberg campus, because obviously I've never been there. Obviously I've never been there, but I think that what we need to, as Stellenbosch students, look into is the fact that we can't be doing these things where we get people from outside of the Stellenbosch community to look inside and see this is what's happening on Stellenbosch campus, because everybody knows that Stellenbosch is pretty racist, classist, and quite sexist at that. But the extent to which they know it and to the extent to which they see it is very different from how we experience it. So I think just in terms of taking this movement from our front yard, from our backyards, and just making it something a lot bigger, I think we do need to, again, use these mechanisms, because the university said free Wi-Fi, guys, let's go. They said free Wi-Fi. We should be watching these TED Talks. We should be sharing them amongst each other. And just going back to what Jacques said about getting the house to engage, especially these men's residences to engage, is show people things that they understand in their own language. And I'm not speaking now like, a literal language like Afrikaans or whatever it is. But if people understand memes, get to it with the memes. If people understand, literature like proper books, like get to them through those mediums. I think Lily Quinn said this from Eve. She said it in our previous live on Instagram, is that not everybody wants to read big, theses, and they don't want to read big books. And that's very fine and understandable, but read something, see something, watch something that's going to expand your knowledge. And I think that that's one way, perhaps, just thinking now on what's our way forward as the Stellenbosch communities. We need to start getting through to people in a language in which they understand. Everybody posts their textbook notes sales on the back of the bathroom stalls. And I think that if it takes for us to stick up our movement posters on these bathroom stalls, I think that that's what we would have to do, and that's what we should be doing, just because it is something that we can't tangibly do right now. And it's not big in that it's not a grand gesture, but it's big in that somebody is seeing it and somebody might have some sort of takeaway from it.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to add one small thing on what Tejo just said. So that was a very, very important point, especially I think in the context of men's races, where I believe possibly like 90%, maybe even more, of the residents have never had any kind of exposure to feminism, feminist language, even maybe liberal language. And we have to take that into account and not really demonize them for just simply not knowing what's going on. I remember in one of our engagements, we were talking about the memorandum and specifically about rape culture. And I was trying to explain to them, like, rape culture doesn't mean that they're saying that you are all rapists and that you are all monsters. It means this and this and this. And for like half an hour, we were having this discussion about what is rape culture even, and none of them knew what it was. We all had like our own understandings of what it is, and no one really seemed to really grasp what this concept means because of the language because of what it sounds that it means. Similar thing with men are trash. Most of the men would think that is a personal attack on them. And I really think it's important to be able to explain those things in terms that people can understand and relate with, not diminishing the concepts, but really just conveying them in an effective way that doesn't alienate people immediately and immediately make them defensive. Because when people are defensive, then they don't change their minds on anything. Then they're a closed book. So I think that's very important. And then just another can of worms, but this is not something we should really discuss now because it's too complex. But we also take into account that people have very important presuppositions and worldviews that precede any ideas that they may have about these issues. So my particular interest is the interaction of the Christian worldview and Christian ethics with things like anti-GBV or queer us or whatever, because obviously people's religion plays a massive, massive important part in their behavior, in their thinking, in the things that they're willing to be involved in. Even personally, for me, it plays a massive role in terms of how I associate with social movements and with political ideologies. So that's also something that's so important to take into account, and to really just be aware of that, this person that you're talking with, this person might be a Muslim or a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever, and how is that going to affect the way in which they relate with this cause.
Shan, before I comment, did you have something to say? Yeah.
Yeah. So also just to just another layer to this conversation, is just a quick thing, is because what we're doing right now is that we're highlighting a variety of experiences and actions that we can take on to broaden this movement and to see what we can do maybe in 2021. And I think that I'm personally not someone who polices activism, because femicide is a multifaceted issue. We need multifaceted approaches. But I do want to stress that we still have a responsibility to the most vulnerable people in our societies and the most vulnerable experiences in our societies. We have women who need to be economically empowered. We have women who need to have cultural conversations as part of this movement. We don't want the erasure of queer and trans experiences as we move forward. So even though maybe we don't always have the best access to actions, this is something that we need to take in mind. Yeah, you can maybe do something for your community, but constantly keep that in mind when you're looking at your own personal expansion, your grassroots organizations expansion, your structural expansion. Well, yeah, that's just what I wanted to highlight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm purely looking at time because I think what tends to happen with these panel discussions is we start raising more questions than we thought we had, and then solutions becomes like this 5-minute chat just ghosted in the end because we were like, but actually, during the whole conversation. But I really don't want this to be longer than 2 hours just because people have limited attention spans. Unfortunately, that's just the chat that is the chat. So in starting to wrap up this conversation, I think we've touched on numerous things, and I personally was trying to take notes on, how we can start directing things in 2021. So I just want to go around the table, final thoughts in terms of reflecting on the movement over, 1 year, everything that we've accomplished. I think we've been on the news numerous times. We've had some of our comrades being arrested. So on a national sphere, I think we've done great things in terms of bringing out mayors going, involving high schools. I don't know if you guys know this, but the Pretoria protest was actually mainly organized by high school students. And we were just there as last minute conveners because it was the first protest that they had ever attended or organized. So the reach on, what the youth has expanded. Our reach on the fact that we've expanded the type of policy approaches that we're taking. I mean, I don't think we ever intended on being a social media move, having so much social media orientation is the word I'm looking for. In terms of the type of movement we were, it really was just spur of the moment to announce the next time we were going to meet on the Roy plane because we kept filling up the group chats too quickly. And it ended up being a huge medium. So I think that there are a huge amount of wins this year, added pressure that we've added on to government and institutions, especially after joining hands with numerous other organizations and collectively just ensuring that our different versions on how to achieve the end goal are going to be worked with hand in hand, and those mechanisms are going towards putting our energy towards the same end goal that we have. So I think that we've really grown a lot bigger than we ever thought we would, and we've reached a lot of heights that I never thought we would. So there's a lot of positive here. Although I think that we have spent a lot of time on the negatives and the issues that we have, it's very important to identify them so that we know how to strategize what our second year plan of action is going to look like. So I'm just going to go around the table if anyone wants to add some last minute thoughts, personal things on what they're going to take home, how they've possibly engaged with the movement over the past year, and just those general happy TED Talk 2-minute sentences before we close the discussion. I'm going to start with Hawa.
So Grace, I can definitely say that in my term as a House Committee member, I'm really going to take these discussions from residents and I'm going to implement it in the community that I live in, because I feel like once we've got these social justice conversations going, the momentum is there to just keep it running. So that's what I'm going to try and take home by the end of my term, get people from my little town in KZN to start talking about this and how we can end it on a community level, how we can protect the women and queer bodies of our country and our communities. That's what I want to do. I will do it.
Thank you so much. Tejo, do you want to go next?
I I just feel like there's so much to say and there's so much still to be done. But I think the first thing that I'm very grateful for is that we do have this platform, because 11,500 people is a lot. It's a lot of people to have in your space and to have watching what you say and hearing what you do. So I think one of my biggest things is just to be more, I don't want to say careful, but to be more intentful in what I'm doing, because there's a lot of people watching. And I mean, that's not to say that I've been very like callous about what I've been doing previously, but I think just the realization that there's so many people watching and there's so many people who want to get involved and are involved is just that, to put that to better use. And just also in my personal like capacity, in my own like, you know, tiny circle, I think I'm very keen to be pushing my friends into this space, into the spaces that I'm in, because I think I, not to like toot my own horn, but I do think I'm the more radical one out of us all. And I just think what I want to get a lot more people to see why that is, because it's not like I'm just speaking to speak, or it's not like I'm just speaking to constantly, you know, be arguing, but because I am so passionate about like just human rights, because that's what this is. It's human rights that we're talking about. So I think just after this conversation is just to go out and be more intentful with the work that we do, and in my own space as well, just to get more people to be willing to listen. So yeah.
I think we all identified with that on a spiritual level, sis. Then, Jacques, do you want to go for it?
Sure thing. So yeah, what I really took from this discussion that I'll definitely be implementing is the thing that Tejo mentioned about the discussions around male violence in the resident space, and the fact that there isn't really any emphasis on the victims of it, that there's no discussion around it. So really trying to change that culture one bit at a time. And also, yeah, just continuing the conversation in our space and making sure that, especially that the language that is used in institutions like anti-GBV is intelligible to the people that it's addressed towards, and making sure that they understand the importance of it, and making sure that they can understand how they can be involved as well. Because I think for a lot of them, it's overwhelming to go out and protest, or even do something small like share a petition. Like we said, we're all in different scenarios where different levels of activism are have different levels of difficulty for us personally, and just helping people to understand that you don't have to immediately jump to being this radical activist that is trying to solve all of the world's problems, but you can start small and you can build it up, and you can also just hold yourself accountable to keep on growing in terms of that. So I think really just spreading that kind of message in my capacity as an ARCOM member will probably be what I'll be focusing on.
Awesome, thank you so much. Shan, do you want to go for it?
I think I should take this opportunity to really thank Anti-GBVSU for all the work that you've done, and also for the immense amount of responsibility and trust you put in me this year to be able to work alongside you and march alongside you at our national protests, and to just be involved. I think that, like I said, I'm involved with a lot of organizations, and this is one that I thoroughly stand by. I really appreciate the work that you guys do, and I'm so glad that I can support it in any capacity. So I just wanted to really take the time to say that thank you, because I'm not going to get another public place that's recorded to say that. And you know, for me, activism, or anti-femicide activism in 2021, it's going to be a lot more democratized. We're going to get a lot more input from as many people as possible, and we're going to empower as many people as possible to not only use their voices, but I always say, like, have your feet shown and have your fists shown. And for me, Activism 2021 is going to have a huge evolution of our online space in a way that's going to benefit us far beyond what we know right now. And for me, I mean, for my personal capacity, something that I also want to highlight is that I'm constantly here to assess the role of white women in the movement, and to assess how we can better support the amazing work that I'm constantly seeing Black queer activists doing. And that's me for 2021.
Awesome, thank you so much. I think on a personal level, I'm just gonna be kinder to myself. I think that's like my self-reflection for 2020 is just like, activism is a lot, eh? It's not these cute reels that people do in the shower without thought. It's a lot. But generally, I think as the movement entirely, one of the things I'm really keen. I think this discussion brought a lot of light on the different mechanisms beyond what I even thought we could use as mechanisms to promote activism. You know, I didn't even think of that. So I love, you know, having spaces where we can all share our ideas and come together and go for that. So I'm very excited to see that implemented. Crossing fingers, you know, maybe we'll see anti-GBV underscore VITS, anti-GBV underscore UKZN, anti-GBV underscore national spaces, radical revolution, reform, burn it all, kill the patriarchy, live your best Khaleesi lifestyle and all that jazz. So yeah, I'm just, if this was the growth over 1 year and most of that growth was done literally through forwarding a poster on Instagram that was made on Canva in 2 hours, and now we've blown up to the platform that we have. I'm so excited to see what 2021 brings. So for those of y'all who watch this, because there's only 7 of us live, and hopefully the rest of y'all will be watching this on our IGTV. Personally, I just want to say thank you, because it can be quite defeating to think like, you know, as a woman being pro lives of women, it starts to become quite draining, because you start questioning, like, is anyone listening? Because every single day the headline is just, at this rate, it's like another one. So having that amount of support and engagement constantly growing, I think is really just something that keeps, you know, it's like we've created a safe space, a mass safe space, even though we don't know most of the people there, to just know that there is a way to support each other and keep going forward. So I'm super excited for 2021. 2020 is finally done. I don't know why in my head, magically 1st of January, all my worries will go away, but that's currently the mindset I'm sticking to. So yeah, thank you everyone. Super excited for what 2021 will bring. And to our panelists, thank you so much for taking your time out to come have these important chats. Thanks. Okay.
Thanks everyone for coming in.